In this lesson, we'll take a look at lighting, texturing, and rendering an interior scene. Let's start by clicking on the interactive render, and you'll see that for this interior scene, there's a little bit of light peeking in, but it's quite dark. The first thing we can do is take a look at the shadows in SketchUp. Checking what time of day it is and day of the year, we can get more sun to shine through. For this example, we're going to set the time to 6:50 in the morning and the date of the year to April 8. Once you've got the general position of the sun figured out, the next option for brightening up this image is to go into V-Ray's Asset Editor, go to the gear icon, and find the camera settings so that we can change the exposure value. We can brighten the image up by sliding the slider to the right, or dim it down by sliding it to the left. Let's go ahead and set the exposure value to 11.3. Also, because the sun is quite early in the morning, we're going to have a warmer sun temperature coming through. So to counteract that, we click on the white balance here and neutralize that warm color by sliding this to a warmish yellow. Notice just beneath the white balance setting is the effects menu. Twirl that open and you see vertical tilt. You can slide that slider to the left or to the right to skew the tilting of the vertical edges in your image. Let's go ahead and set this to 0.24. And that should straighten up all our vertical lines in the image. Now I'd still like to brighten this up a bit, so it's time to go over to the Lights tab and see what we can do about the sunlight. We're using the sky model of Hasek, which is the preferred and default method, but we want a little bit more control here, so we're going to flip down and pick the option for CIE Clear. Notice that enables this horizontal illumination. This is going to allow us to control the brightness of the sky. So for example, if you set this to 0, the sky turns off. The sunlight's still coming in, but the sky brightness is all the way dark. Let's do the opposite. Let's double it from what it was, 50,000. And that will start pumping in some additional light. Also, we have very hard shadows here. So the way we fix that is to go to the size multiplier for the sun. And let's dial that up to 3. I'll close this down. And it looks like, as this is rendering, like the light quality is starting to approach something that will be workable for the next step. We're nearly done setting up the lighting for this scene, but one more thing we can do is add portal lights to all of the openings here. So first, navigate to the outside of the model, and we'll use V-Ray's plane light to do this. So click on the icon in the toolbar, and just draw a plane light somewhere on a vertical surface. Then we'll take the Select tool and the Move tool to select and then move it so that it's in line with the upper corner of this opening here. Then we can scale it in and down so that it entirely covers this opening. The white side of this light should be facing in, so right-click and flip along the blue direction. We'll repeat these steps to put portals on all of the other openings. And once you're all done, click on the Render Camera scene to get back inside. Next, let's go ahead and start an interactive render. You'll notice that the scene begins to render with a bunch of new artificial plane light flooding through. We still have to set these lights up to be portal lights. To do that, let's go to the V-Ray Asset Editor, and in the Light tab, click on the rectangle light and fly this menu out. To be sure that these plane lights are working as you would expect, you can change the color. Try something bright. And notice how it affects the render. It's just casting a bunch of bright light into the model. However, we want this to be a portal light. Notice the option here for portal light. Go ahead and click that to check it on. And the render immediately changes. No longer do you see the colored light, but now you're actually seeing an amplification of the real light from behind these windows. Notice here it says simple. Click on this arrow and you'll notice that you have two options, accurate versus simple. Simple will just take the skylight and amplify it. Accurate will take objects as well from behind the portal lights and factor them into the illumination. The simple method is faster, and in this case we don't have anything else behind the windows, so we'll keep it at simple. Notice too, once the portal light option is on, the intensity of these lights and the color will not change anything about what you see in the rendering. It'll just re-render as a portal light or an amplification of the outside light. Let's go ahead and stop the interactive render. And then in the frame buffer, I want to preview the effect that the portal lights will have on this rendering. I'll click on the history, and we want to set the history to the rendering folder that you received with this training. Notice that you'll have one that says portal lights off and one that says portal lights on. Double click on the portal lights off and you'll get a preview of what the rendering is going to look like soon. Then switch to the portal lights on and notice how much brighter the interior gets. So toggling between off and on gives you a great sense of what we just set up. For now, we can turn off the history, and I'll pull the frame buffer off the window here to get back over to SketchUp. And let's open up our layers and toggle on the environment layer. To see what you've done, navigate to outside of the model, and you'll see that there are these environment images when you toggle them off or on. These will just be helpful for the upcoming steps so that we can see things out of the windows. I'll go ahead and click on the render camera scene again. Now that we've got our lighting all set, let's take a look at some of our settings for our rendering. Click on the V-Ray Asset Editor, and in the Settings tab, notice where it says Renderer. We're going to be taking a look at the extra options here. Click on the flyout menu. And we want to look specifically at global illumination. Go ahead and click on that menu to expand it. Global illumination is important for interiors because it's going to help us with secondary light bounces to illuminate the space. You notice here we only have one parameter that we can affect. It depends on which rendering engine we're using though. So let's switch off interactive. That'll switch us into progressive. And now we see we have some more controls here. For the primary and secondary rays, the brute force light cache combination is the preferred method for rendering on the interior. However, when we're still determining if our setup is good, we may want to choose rendering settings that render faster. Try this, where it says primary rays, flip down the menu option, and pick irradiance map. Using the irradiance map for the primary rays will render at a lower quality, but much faster for draft purposes. For the secondary rays, we'll leave it at light cache, which is especially good at illuminating interiors. Let's also go over here where the quality slider says medium, and let's slide that all the way down to draft. These settings are great when you want to try a draft render, so let's go ahead and do that. The first pass was the light cache, and the second pass with the buckets was the irradiance map. So it rendered fairly quickly, although you can see the quality isn't that great. So that we can compare later, let's open up the history, and we'll go ahead and save this. Next, we'll just make a change to the quality here. Let's switch from draft to medium, and then let's re-render. You can see that took quite a bit longer to render. Go ahead and save that one to the history. And if you set it up to do an A/B comparison, you can see how much of a difference just sliding that slider over to medium can make. One last change, let's go back over to the settings, and this time let's set irradiance map back to brute force, and then let's click render. Once this one is done, go ahead and save it to the history, and we can set it up to compare it with the others. Notice that with brute force, it's especially good with the details. So not only is the quality better, but the details at some of the edges get a little bit crisper. Once you're done previewing your global illumination, you can go back over to your asset editor, and we'll just set the quality slider up to high for the next step. Now that we have our lighting all set, it's time to turn our attention to the materials. We'll start by adding materials for the biggest surfaces, since they'll have the most impact on the global illumination of this space. First, let's talk about the glass of the windows. Go to your V-Ray Asset Editor and click on the Materials tab. You'll see in the list here there's the word glass, and if you fly out this menu here, you'll note from the categories, if you click on the glass folder, the library shows us glass. as well as several others. The one that's just plain glass, that's what we used here. So we were able to drag that in ahead of time so that the glass could immediately shine the light through. One note about the glass. If I come back over into SketchUp and go into Edit Component mode here, I can view just these components and show you that it's important that the glass has thickness to it so that the refraction works when we have the glass properties in V-Ray. The light will refract properly. For now, I'll go ahead and come back to the original view. Let's go ahead and add some wood to the floor. In the Asset Editor, make sure you're in the Materials list, and fly out the left menu here. Scroll down in the categories to Wood and Laminate, and find something in the library that you'd like to test out on the floor. Once you find something you like, drag it into your material list. Remember to select the floor, and then you can right-click and apply the material to selection. Don't forget that there's a scale associated with these textures, and so you'll want to fix that. Back over in SketchUp, go into the Edit mode for the material, and set the scale. Next, we'll want to test this out by rendering, but first let's change some settings so that we can preview things faster. We'll set the quality slider down to draft. We're in the progressive rendering mode here so that when we fly out this menu, we open up the global illumination. Remember that we can change the primary rays to a radiance map to get a good draft setting. We can close that menu in, and let's go ahead and click render. Let's go ahead and save this image using the history. Let's try another wood out on the floor. I'll move the frame buffer over. And back over in the Asset Editor, pick the Materials icon, fly out that left menu. Scroll down to the Wood and Laminate category, and scroll through the library until you find a darker wood. I'll go with this laminate here. Remember, you drag it into the material list. Make sure your underlying floor group is selected, and then go ahead and right-click and apply material to selection. Re-render to compare the difference. Save this one to the history as well. And if you preview them side by side, notice not only the color change, but notice on the walls too, the color bleeding. So this is what happens in the real world when light bounces back off of a colored surface and hits other nearby surfaces. So you can see how that greatly impacts the illumination inside. Let's go ahead and change the wood one last time. Scroll the menu up till you find the flooring laminate E narrow. Drag that into the material list. Right-click and apply material to selection. Don't forget to change its scale. And then back over in the Asset Editor, this bottom right button here is for purging unused materials. Go ahead and click on that to get rid of those other woods that we had been trying out but no longer need. The next set of big surfaces we'll want to take care of are the walls. In the V-Ray Asset Editor, under the Materials tab, with the flyout menu open, let's go to the Wall Paint and Wallpaper folder. In the library here, we can search it. Let's type the word fine, and let's drag the Wall Paint Fine Grain White over into our material list. Let's also apply that texture to our walls. So we'll select the wall group and come back over and apply the material to the selection. Notice the description says fine grain, and there is a scale set here. So let's go ahead and fix the scale in SketchUp. You'll notice though that when you go to edit that material, the width and the height are disabled here. That's because the fine grain texture that's being used here is not something that's being applied in the viewport here in SketchUp. So here's how we fix that. With the Wall Paint Fine Grain selected, click on this right flyout menu, and you'll see a bunch of extra properties for that material. We need to find the image that's being used for the fine grain. And it turns out, if you scroll down and you open the Maps section and scroll down further, there's a texture being used for the bump map so that it looks like a fine grain. Click on this little checkered icon here, And you notice there's an eyeball icon with a slash through it. That means it's not visible in the SketchUp model. Click on that to turn on the visibility. Once you click back over on SketchUp, you'll see that there's a repeating, strange-looking texture going on in the walls. But this is all that we need to go back now to the materials and to edit that material to correct its scale. Once you've corrected the scale, go back to the asset editor and check that eyeball icon again to hide it in the viewport. Then go ahead and click back. While we're in here, slide the slider up and let's go ahead and change the diffuse color by clicking there. And we'll go ahead and change this to 220. Next, let's go ahead and drag the other wall paint fine grain yellow into the material list. I'll move the asset editor out of the way for a moment. Click back over into SketchUp. Notice that other wall texture went away. And I want to select this little wall piece here, and I'll apply this material to that selection. Again, we'll need to fix the scale, so remember those steps. Fly out the menu, scroll down to find the bump map, click on the checkered icon to access the texture, click on the eyeball so that it's visible in SketchUp, then open the materials browser and fix the scale. Then back over in the asset editor, click on the icon again to hide it from viewport, go back, and go ahead and fold this in. Now we should be able to go ahead and re-render. Now that we have materials applied to all the major surfaces in our model, we'll turn on a furniture layer and add materials to the rest. First, I'll collapse this history down, and then go to my layers window. Check on the furniture layer, and underneath you'll see that a bunch of furniture has already been added to the scene. Let's add materials to the furniture. In your V-Ray asset editor, under the material tab, click the flyout, and let's pick some different metals. We'll go to the metal categories. We're looking for aluminum blurry, iron blurry, and this metallic paint bronze dark. Once you've dragged them all to your material list, it's time to apply them to pieces of the furniture. I'll move the asset editor over and back over in SketchUp. With your select tool, select the railing on the stairs, this lamp, these hanging pendants, track lighting above, and also get the window frame. Be careful not to get the glass of the window. Then let's go ahead and apply the iron blurry to the selection. Let's be sure to fix that. I can see there's a scale there, so I'll fly this menu over. Scroll down to the bump map and click on the texture icon here. And we need to click on the icon here so that we can go back over into SketchUp and open our materials browser and go to edit the iron blurry so that it's at the right scale. Once we're done, you can check that back on, click back, and we're done with that. I'll collapse this back down so I can see a few more things. In SketchUp with the select tool, we'll select these tables here and we'll apply the metallic paint bronze dark. And then lastly, let's select these pots and we'll apply aluminum blurry. Let's think about the TV here. We'll need another material, so we'll fly out this menu and let's go to the plastic category. And let's find the plastic simple shiny black. Drag that over. In SketchUp, select the TV and we'll apply that material to the TV. And then let's make one small change. With the flyout menu here, we get the extra options, and we're just going to turn the glossiness down a bit to 0.88. Then I'll fly this in, and once we've added some basic materials to all of these different pieces of furniture, let's go ahead and click render to see what we get. Alright, so the last two things we need to address are the sofa back here and then these chairs a little closer to the camera. These are proxies, so if you check in your asset editor here, you'll see a chair proxy and a sofa proxy. So these are handled just a little bit differently. First, we'll deal with the sofa. Let's go over to our Materials tab and fly out the left menu. We need to pick some fabric. So go to the Fabric folder, and you can choose whichever you'd like, but I happen to know the two that'll work nicely for this are Fabric B01 here, so I'll drag that in, and then just a little lower on the list, this Fabric D03 yellow. I'll drag those both over. Back over in the frame buffer, let's go ahead and draw a region render around just that sofa back there in the background. And then let's start an interactive render. This will help us preview just the changes we're making to the sofa. In the asset editor, there's already a material here that says Sofa MM. That stands for multi-material. So we've already applied a multi-material to this sofa proxy. Let's see how that one works. Go ahead and select that, and I'll close that side down and fly out the right menu. A multi-material allows us to add multiple materials to this particular object. And each material slot here, you can see there are 4, corresponds to a different part of this proxy. The first one is for the sofa itself, and then the next 3 are for some of the pillows that are on the sofa. Let's go ahead and assign the fabric materials by dropping down the menu, and we'll assign the gray fabric, the B01 fabric, to the first 3 slots. Then for the final one, let's assign the yellow fabric. You'll notice there that that turns that back pillow there yellow. You see that these all have scale, but because these proxies have UV maps already applied to them, we don't need to correct the scale in SketchUp. So that's an advantage there. I'll close this one down, and let's deal with the 2 chairs now. We'll draw a new region render here around just the chairs. And for these, we'll need to make our own multi-material. So here's how that process works. Over in the asset editor, in the material list, down at the bottom left, click to add a material, and we can choose the option for multi-material. We can rename this to Chair MM. Next, we'll need some materials to add to this multi-material, so I'll fly out that left menu. We'll need a leather, so I'll go to that category. And I'll scroll this up. I'm looking for leather B01 black here. I'll drag that into the list. Then I'm also looking for a wood. So I'll scroll down and go to the wood and laminate folder. And near the very bottom, we'll get this dark veneer and drag it into the list. Now I'll move the asset editor over so that I can select the chair in the background. And then again, I want to apply that multi-material to that selection. Now the last step is to set those materials we just added so that they apply to this multi-material. So with the multi-material selected, go ahead and click on the flyout over here. And you notice there aren't any texture slots already pre-assigned, so we'll do that ourselves. Let's go ahead and click the Add Material button 3 times. And then what we'll do is assign the first one to the veneer. That's the wooden part of the chair. We'll assign the second one to the leather. And the third one, we'll use the aluminum blurry that we already have. Remember, there's no need to scale these materials because again, the proxies here are UV mapped. So that's taken care of already for us. I'll fly this menu back in and I can see here that those materials are beginning to apply to the chair. Of course, we need to handle the other chair as well. So I'll just move the frame buffer over, select that chair in SketchUp, and then make sure to apply the same multi-material to that selection. Once everything is looking correct to you, go ahead and pause the interactive render, disable the region render, and we'll go back over and we'll do one more draft render using progressive mode and see how everything looks. With all of the lighting and the materials done, let's go ahead and work on creating a high quality render. In the V-Ray Asset Editor, in the Settings tab, we'll start by setting the final resolution for our render. You should choose a setting that works for your computer, knowing that the larger this is, the longer it will take to render this image. Also, we'll switch off interactive and switch off progressive so that we're using bucket mode. And for quality, we'll drag our setting over to high. Let's fly out this menu here to see a few more options we have. Under Global Illumination, let's set that irradiance map back to brute force. And then down in the Render Elements tab, click to add a render element. We're going to use the Denoiser. The Denoiser will help us remove noise from the final image, which there'll be a little bit since we're using the high quality instead of the very high. Let's see what options we have underneath if we twirl down the Denoiser here. You see there's a preset. Flip that menu down so we can set the strength of the Denoiser. Just be careful. If you go too strong, you'll lose some details. Because we're already using a quality setting of high, this mild preset here should do the trick. One more render element. Click here, and let's use the material ID. The material ID will assign a color to each different material that can be used later in a post-processing program like Photoshop. So what it amounts to is a mask around every material that we can use later to control individual materials in something like Photoshop. The color that Material ID assigns can be set manually if you'd like in the Materials tab, clicking on any material that's being used, and in the flyout menu to the right, scrolling down, clicking on the Options tab, and then the Color tab here. You see the ID color. You can switch it here to something that you'd like. But there's no need to go through and change all of the ID colors, so we'll just leave the rest at their default. And then when you're all ready, go ahead and click Render. To skip ahead to what the final rendering will look like, you can click on the folder icon here, and then navigate to where the final.vrimg file is, and go ahead and open that. This is what the final rendering will look like. A few things here. If you zoom in and look over, you can see a bit of noise in some of the details. Up at the upper left, flip this menu down, and you have that denoiser that was applied. Go ahead and click there, and notice how it clears up some of the noise. I'll zoom back out. Another thing I want to take a look at, flip down the menu and see what Material ID looks like, so you can see different colors applied to each of the different materials. I'll flip back to the RGB, and let's apply just a few basic color corrections. Click in the bottom left corner to turn those controls on. We'll start with exposure. Let's lower the highlight burn so that we get a little bit less washout in those areas. Be careful not to go too low because you'll flatten the image. Also, let's check on the curve. We can adjust the brightness and contrast of the image this way. And then we can also check on the white balance. This is another place where we can control the color temperature of the image. Go ahead and play around with the settings a bit till you have something that you like, and then go ahead and save the image. In this lesson, we'll make a night version of this scene. To do that, we'll need to adjust the lighting. But first, let's click on the Asset Editor, and let's get set with some preview settings that will render very quickly. First, let's switch on Progressive, and then for quality, let's slide our slider down to low, so we can preview things quickly. Also, click on Render Output, and we can lower the resolution here. I'll go with 800. Another thing that will help it render quickly, click on the flyout and click on the Global Illumination, and remember that we can set the primary rays to irradiance map. One more thing we can do to preview the lighting faster is check on Material Override. One thing to be careful though, we should check and make sure that the glass won't get overridden so that we can see whatever light we do have passing through. To do that, click on the Materials tab. In the Material list, make sure you have the glass selected and click on the flyout menu. And if you scroll down the list near the bottom, click on Options and scroll down further, you see there's a checkbox here for Can Be Overridden. So in this case, the glass would be overridden or would be opaque. We want the glass to still work or let any sort of light through that we have out there. So we'll go ahead and uncheck this option. I'll fly this menu back in. Now we're starting to get into the territory of lighting. So we want to turn out the lights more or less. Let's go to the Light tab. And for the sunlight here, we want to click here to turn it off. There's more light than just the sunlight that will enter the scene though. Back over in the settings, there's an option for environment here. Go ahead and click on that. And currently it's using a sky map. We want to turn that map off so that the sky isn't casting light as well. Right click and go ahead and clear that. Now if the background is black, there'll be zero light in here, which will be way too dark for a night scene. So instead, let's click on this swatch and let's switch this to a saturated blue color, something like what you see here. Then I'll close that down. Another thing we have to think about is now that we've darkened the lighting, we're going to need to adjust the exposure of the camera. So click on the camera option here, and where the exposure value is, I happen to know that 7 would be fairly good for what we're doing here. So go ahead and set that. So after you've set up some quick draft settings, and you've done a few things to change the lighting for this scene, let's go ahead and click Render to preview what we've done. Once you're comfortable with the environment lighting, it's time to add some artificial lights to the interior. So let's go ahead and do that. Go back over into SketchUp, and we'll start by handling the standing lamp here. We're actually going to use 2 lights to help with this. For one, we'll start with a spotlight that we don't actually put inside this light, but instead put into a general region of the scene so that we can add some lighting to the furniture overall. So to do that, in the V-Ray toolbar, click on the spotlight, and let's go ahead and click where we think is roughly above this table here. Then we'll move this light into position, and what we're trying to do is get back so that when we're back where the camera is, that this will appear to be just behind that light. Next, let's go back to the standing lamp. In orbit so you can get underneath it, we'll add a sphere light on the inside. So click on that sphere light tool and click to add a sphere light and move it down just a little bit so it's not intersecting anything. Next, let's go over to these hanging lights. For these, let's go ahead and make sure that you get inside of the innermost component so that we can place the light there. In this case, we're going to use the IES light. Go ahead and navigate to the Assets folder and pick the 10.ies file and click Open. Then click to place it. Notice that it places an IES light in all of the instances of the component at the same time. Then you can get outside of that component and come back over to the beginning of the scene. One last thing, on the floor next to us here, we'll draw a plane light. So click on that tool and draw one on the floor. Then let's move it up. And it's going to be a fill light, so let's point it back at the space. Remember, the white side should face towards the space there. And take the scale tool and scale it up a bit to about that size. Then I'll click back on the Scene tab, and I want to place this so that it's something like what you see here on my screen. One more thing to keep in mind, if you've been clicking on the Render Camera scene, then you may have inadvertently turned that layer back on for the environment. So just make sure, if that's going on, that not only have you checked that off, but that you've updated the scene to reflect that. Now we'll want to preview how these artificial lights look, but we'll want to do it in the context of how they interact with the materials in the scene. So back over in your Settings tab, make sure to go down and check off the Material Override function. And then let's scroll up, click on Interactive to switch on Interactive Rendering mode, and then let's start an interactive render. We can see immediately that a bunch of new light renders into the scene. Let's go ahead and stop the interactive render right away though. We want to disable all of the lights except for the spotlight so we can concentrate on it first, and then we'll layer the others back in. So to do that, let's click on the Light tab. Now you'll notice here that we have some sky portals in the list, and for me, this third one here, the one that says Sky Portals number 2, if I twirl out the menu while I've selected that, that's actually that last rectangle light I just drew. And so even though it says Sky Portals, we see here it's not a portal light, so it was just incrementally named. That could kind of trick you, so we want to make sure we rename that, and we'll call it Fill Light. Let's also disable that fill light, and we'll also disable the IES light and the sphere light so that we can focus on just the V-Ray spotlight. Now let's restart the interactive render. This allows us to clear out all of that extra light, but we can quickly draw a region around just the area of the spotlight so we can focus there first. Back over in the asset editor, let's pick the spotlight. One of the first things we should do is set the decay. Let's drop the menu down and pick inverse square. Now the light is way too weak, To fix that, let's go up to Units, and we'll set that to watts, and then let's set the intensity to 25. Now the spotlight is way too harsh. We can adjust the cone angle and the penumbra angle to widen that up and also soften its edges. Let's set the cone angle to 1.8 and the penumbra to 0.5. You can also widen the region render to see how that's impacting more of the scene. And then one more thing we should do here is warm this light up a bit. So we'll go ahead and click on that swatch and warm it up. Now we'll handle the sphere light inside of the standing lamp next, and we'll want to match the color to the spotlight we just did. So back over in the asset editor, you can right click on this swatch and click copy, and go over to the sphere light, right click and paste. Be sure to enable it so you can actually see it. Next pick the IES light, let's turn that one back on, and let's warm that color up as well. And then finally let's come back over to the fill light. I'll redraw my region here, and then come back over and enable the fill light. First thing, we don't want to actually see the light. So let's go over here and check on invisible. Next, for the color, let's use a color similar to what we used for the environment lighting earlier. Now the last thing, it's far too bright. So let's go ahead and reduce the intensity. You can play around with the value, and I'll settle on 6. I'll clear the region over here so I can take a quick look at how this is all coming together. Notice if I draw a region around just the shadowing here, these shadows are far too harsh. This is something we can fix back with the spotlight. So I'll click on the spotlight, and our shadow radius is at 0, so we can slide this slider over to see how it impacts those shadows. I'll settle on a value of 2, and you see that's looking nicer there, and you can draw another region here to see how it impacts those shadows as well. Once I've resolved any issues like that, I'll stop the render, and back over in the Settings tab, we'll add one more effect. Under the Camera menu, click on Effects, and we'll add some vignetting. I'll set it to a value of 0.3. Then we'll create a higher quality render. So I'll check off interactive, set the quality to medium, make sure you've disabled any regions, and then go ahead and click render. While the image is rendering, let's go ahead and apply some color corrections. You can apply any that you'd like. I'm going to go to the hue saturation and saturate the image a bit more. And then I'll also go down to the curve and adjust the contrast a bit. In this lesson, we'll talk about render elements. For each render that you have in the V-Ray frame buffer, there are different render passes or elements. And those elements can be rendered separately by V-Ray so that we can assemble them later in a program like Photoshop to have more control over post-production of your image. Let's take a look at the elements. Click on the V-Ray Asset Editor, and in the Settings tab, let's click the flyout, and you'll see here we have render elements. When you click in this area, you see that there are a series of render elements here. And these elements are based off of things that you have in your scene. So for example, we have artificial lights in our scene, so there will be a lighting render element. Go ahead and click to add the lighting render element. Also, click again. We have the global illumination. We'll add that here, and that will just show that particular render pass. Click again, and go down to where it says reflection. We'll add the reflection pass. Click again, and whenever the reflection glossiness is below a value of 1, you'll have this specular element here that you can add, so go ahead and click that. Let's also go find the refraction. For any material, such as the glass, where there is refraction, this will show us the elements we can see through the transparency. We have an open window. We'll be able to see directly through to the background through the opening. And let's add one more. Scroll down to Material ID and click on it to add it. Material ID isolates objects with the same material and renders them with a unique flat color. This can be especially useful when you are post-processing your image in an application like Photoshop because it'll be far easier to select everything that has a common material. Now that we have all of the render elements selected, go ahead and click Render. The final pre-composed image is called RGB color here, but is also known as the beauty pass. But now that you've rendered those elements, flip down this menu and you can see all those channels listed here. So flip through each one of them to see what they look like. Notice for refractions, this is where we would see through the glass, versus if you switch to the background, this is just the element where the window is open. And also take a look at Material ID, where you see that flat color applied to things of similar material. Having all of these channels will be helpful for post-production, but they can also help you quickly troubleshoot whether an issue you're seeing is with one particular element over another. Once you've had a chance to tour through everything, click and hold down on the save icon here, and then hover over the second icon to select it. This will allow you to save not only the beauty pass, but all of those channels so that you can use each of them for post-production. So you can name it, pick the location you want to save, and make sure to save it as OpenEXR. This 32-bit image is recommended for compositing in Photoshop. Then go ahead and click Save. In this lesson, we'll talk about compositing in Photoshop. In V-Ray, we rendered out the different render elements. And here in Photoshop, we have each of those elements here as a layer. Let's first reassemble the beauty pass by turning on all of these layers except for the RGB, and then selecting all of the layers above lighting, switch the blending mode to linear dodge add. You'll notice this looks a lot like the image you rendered in V-Ray, the beauty pass, and here we have the RGB. You can turn it on and see that there's no change or no difference. It's the exact same. Having each of these render elements as separate channels means that we can affect them separately. So for example, you can turn off the reflections to get rid of them altogether or turn them back on, but you can also color correct them individually. Let's do that. Click here to add an adjustment layer, and let's add an exposure adjustment layer. Above in the properties, click on this icon here to make sure that the exposure is applied only to the layer immediately beneath it, in this case reflections. Now you can play around with the exposure for just the reflections. In this case, I'll set it a bit higher. And then you can see the impact by hiding just that exposure layer or showing it. Let's add another exposure adjustment layer to the refractions, again making sure to apply it just to the refractions. And for this one, we're going to darken down the outside. Whatever value we choose here for the refractions, let's go ahead and make sure we use the same value to create another exposure layer for the background so we can match that up. Once you're happy with the color corrections you've made to the individual render elements, go up to your top menu and select Image, then under Mode, let's switch this to 8 bits and click Merge. Now of course you lose some of the power of the 32-bit image, but some new options will become available to us. First, notice that right away the toning of this changed quite a bit. Under Method here in the HDR toning that popped up, let's flip this down to exposure and gamma, and that will match it right back up to where it was when we started. Then go ahead and click OK. Now let's also turn this into a smart object, so right click on that layer and convert to smart object. Then with the layer selected, go up to your top menu where it says Filter and pick Camera Raw Filter. On the right hand side, you'll notice there's a number of properties that you can adjust or filter this image by. I'll click on this Auto button here. It'll automatically adjust a number of the values. Of course, from there, you could decide to slide these a bit more in either direction to your preference, and then when you have something you like, go ahead and click OK. If the filter is too strong, you can double click here and adjust the opacity to your liking. Now lastly, if we want to isolate certain materials for a final color correction pass, we can do that by opening up the Material ID render channel. So let's do that by going up to the File menu, clicking Open, and then navigate to that folder where you have that Interior Night Material ID.exr file, and click Open. We'll need to convert this to an 8-bit file, so I'll go to Image Mode and pick 8 bits, and Merge. I'll switch this back to exposure and gamma, so we have the same colors, and click OK. I'll go ahead and click to drag the layer over to my other composition, and then make sure to position it and snap it to all the edges. Now I can take the Magic Wand tool and click on one of the colors. For example, the walls here, it'll pick everything there that's interconnected that is that Material ID color. Then I can go ahead and hide this layer. Now my selection is being applied down to the walls here. And I can go down and create a new adjustment layer. I'll add a curves adjustment. And then up here I can edit that curve. And then you can continue to add any other adjustments that you'd like. And then when you're all done, you can save the file as a JPEG.